You're joining me today to look at how to sort of develop evidence for the specialist modules in the STP. So a big part of that is going to be obviously related to reflective practice, because that plays a significant part of your evidence, but also sort of the wider evidence development as well. I did this session yesterday, slightly adapted, but for the trainers as well. So they will have had the same information as you're going to get today. So we'll get cracking with that. But just as an aside, if you haven't already, we've got a wealth of resources now for both trainees and trainers in our NHS Learning Hub catalogue. So that first QR code at the top will take you directly to those resources. If you haven't got a login, you can create one really easily now, whether you've got an NHS email address or not. Before, you could only do it independently if you had an NHS one, but now they've changed that, which is fab. So you can access those resources there. If you've already got an e-learning for health login, then you can use that login because they're the same. They use the same credentials. So explore those, and we've got obviously ones around reflection, but also we've got resources in there about all sorts of things. So from action planning, target setting, planning for your learning, all sorts of things to give you some hints and tips around that. They're not obviously not specialism centered, but you know, there's some things in there to support you. But hopefully today, as a group as well, you can share some ideas around what kind of evidence you could use for specific types of training activities. We're going to be using Slido today for your Q&A and to get your sort of feedback on things and sort of ideas. So you can either scan that QR code there, or you can go to slido.com and put evidence25 as the code. But I'll bring this up again when we come to use it. So don't worry if you don't do that straight away. So as we need a context with this, and I'm sure a lot of you know the difference between DTAs and ETAs. If you don't, then don't worry, because I'm going to go through it now. But I think it's a good idea for us to see these side by side to see what the difference is in terms of requirements for evidence generation. What I will say, what I'm sharing today in relation to these training activities, what I'm about to share, is all on our website anyway, under the work-based assessment standards. So on there, and if I remember, I'll show you where those are, but they're really easy to find. They tend to be on our homepage anyway. But always refer back to those if you're unsure about anything. So in terms of when we're talking about DTAs and ETAs, what we mean is developmental training activities are your DTAs and entrustable training activities are your ETAs. Just to say, we're just looking at specialist ones today, so your specific specialism ones. I will be doing in the new year a separate session on the SC1 module, which is professional foundations, which are also DTAs, but obviously they have a different focus. We're just looking at your specialism ones today. So some specialisms have more of one than the other type. Others are a bit more equally split across their programs. And actually, one specific specialism of clinical engineering has all DTAs because of the nature of the specialism itself. So they do vary in frequency depending on the specialism. And that doesn't, you know, one isn't harder than the other. At all. It's just down to what kind of specialism it is. And and the nature of it, really. So we've got developmental training activities, first of all. Now, these are activities basically that support you to develop and improve your practice. However, they're ones that are usually undertaken less regularly in the workplace. And they're really there to support you in gaining insight into practice, as opposed to ETAs. So ETAs tend to be sort of your bread and butter activities. So things that you are routine, and you would be expected to be able to undertake those frequently in the workplace and perform them relatively independently, so without direct supervision. Okay. But also part of that is knowing when not to undertake it independently, and that where you might need to actually get support to do that. You know, if it was unsafe for you to do it independently, which brings us to the next one, is the purpose of the evidence for these. So in terms of developmental training activities, you need to be able to show through the evidence that that you actually did engage with that activity, and that it's contributed to the development of your own practice, and that you've identified areas of practice for continued development. Okay. And then the ETAs, you need to demonstrate that you're entrusted to undertake the task without any direct supervision. Okay. But also that you're entrusted to know when not to undertake it, when it would be unsafe for you to undertake it independently, and that you would need to, you recognise that it's out of your own scope of practice, and that you need to actually refer it up to somebody else. So in terms of the evidence that's submitted for each of these, so if it's DTAs, you need evidence that you've actually undertaken the activity. You need to reflect at one or more points in time, and you need an action plan. And if you think about the action plan, it might be that that action plan is sort of further in the future. So you wouldn't necessarily be expected to have satisfied what's in that action plan whilst on programme, because developmental training activities are things that happen less often or not as frequently. You need to be aware of them for your post registration practice, so your post qualifying practice, because they could come up, but you're not expected to have mastered them quite like you would in terms of the entrustable ones. So the entrustable ones, the evidence submitted should show that you can, that you've undertaken that activity repeatedly, consistently, and effectively over time, over a range of situations. So you're going to, because of that, have reflection at different points in time as well, at multiple time points, because you're not just undertaking it once and doing an action plan, you're going to be reflecting. You're going to be doing it multiple times, so you're going to have multiple reflections to show how you're progressing forward and identifying areas that you need to do to progress forward. So I put this in every time. I put it in for trainers as well, to say that the selection of the evidence is personal to your specialism and your training journey. Not all trainees are coming from the same point or same sort of background. So, and not everybody works in the same way. So the evidence that you submit obviously has to meet the minimum requirements for that specific type of training activity, but the volume, you could have two trainees on the same program, same specialism, and at the same point in time, but the evidence, oh, sorry, didn't mean to do that. The evidence that they produce might be um, you know, might be varied and different to each other, and that is fine. Just to say, you know, just as a reminder that you know, you have these series of training activities for a module, and then the skills and knowledge you've developed will be showcased to an assessor by the completion of the in-person work-based assessment. So like your DOPS, your OCEs and your CBDs. So, you know, those training activities serve to prepare you for those. And that's where the evidence can also support you in terms of being able to revisit those training activities in order to prepare you for those in-person assessments. So what we're going to look at is, first of all, is reflection. Now, you might have attended some sessions before where I've talked about reflection, but it's important for us to recap that and relate it to these specialist modules. Because how you, although you might follow the same processes to reflection as you did maybe for your OCEs, so the ones in your rotations, obviously the focus is going to be different for these reflections now, because you're actually, you're not observing others, you're actually assessing your own practice now. So these are quotes and definitions that I use a lot, but it's, you know, I'm not going to read them out to you. You can see them on screen. But really, the purpose of reflection is about leading to improved practice through gaining that greater insight into your own practice. And so it's about learning, basically. And that's what we've got to see it as. It's not something about just describing what happened. It isn't just about, you know, saying, oh, I felt really bad about this, you know, just focusing on your feelings. It is about ultimately taking that opportunity to actually identify what you can learn from having that experience and how that's going to influence your practice moving forward. Okay, so I like the work of Jenny Moon, and I've uploaded quite a few of her resources as part of the 2 introductory modules on reflective practice that I've put in the Learning Hub, because she makes very practical applications to that kind of work-based environment rather than very theoretical, if I can say it. And moving away from that very academic and more to the very practical application of those skills. So she links reflective practice very much to these 5 stages of learning to actually emphasize the fact that reflection should be about learning. And starting off with reflections, you know, trainees and individuals tend to find that they're sort of hitting more surface learning to begin with, and that's fine, because actually reflection and reflective practice is a skill that needs nurturing and developing, and it comes from any other skill. You know, it comes from practicing and getting feedback and engaging with that as an activity regularly. What I will say as a caveat as well is we automatically assume, and we'll come to this a bit later anyway, but we automatically assume that reflection only comes from writing things down. I like to refer to it as reflective thinking rather than reflective writing, because, you know, reflection is about something that we do cognitively, and sometimes, you know, it doesn't have to be in its written form. It's useful in its written form because it allows us in some way or other to revisit it later on. It's good. I say it's good in a written form. It's good to have a record of it, and how you have that record might be a different way. So it could be that you do it audio or visually, which we'll come to later too. There is something about just writing sometimes that can be quite a release for people, but for other people it might create a barrier. So why have a barrier to learning that we can remove And if writing is a barrier for some people, then why not remove that barrier and have other ways of recording it if you want it recorded? So we'll come to that later anyway. So the 5 stages of learning, then you've got them separated out into surface learning and deep learning. So at the top we've got stage 1, which is noticing. So under this, this is where you start to register a topic, event or incident as being important in some way or interesting. It piques your interest and thinks, actually, this is quite significant in terms of my own practice and learning. Stage 2 is where you start to make sense of it. So you start to think more about what you've noticed and you try to understand it better. So that's where you're taking a little bit of a step back and starting to reconsider it. And then stage 3 is sort of the crossroads point, or it's another analogy I can use, is where you're starting to enter into moving from that surface learning into deeper learning. And you're going to try to start to make some rudimentary connections with the ideas or with the experience that you've had. Okay, you're going to start to try and make some meaning out of it. So what does this mean for my practice? What does this mean for the way I approach things, etc.? Okay. And then stage 4 is when we're starting to really reflect, and it's where you're working with that meaning. So you start to make links with other ideas and events, so previous experiences. At this point, you know, you're starting to reflect. So you're starting to think about what impact this is going to have on your ongoing practice and how you can actually start to make that deeper understanding and apply it to your practice. And then stage 5 is what is referred to as transformative learning. And this is where you reach the point where you can use what you've learned from those experiences and formulate your own new ideas in terms of how it's going to influence your practice, but also you start to really understand what you would do if a similar situation arose in the future. It might not be an identical situation, but you're able to start to see how your experiences in one situation could influence what you do in the future in other situations. So if we put this into the direct context of what we're talking about in relation to reflection. Now, this might be something that you've already seen before if you've attended other talks that I've done similar to this. So as a quick sort of to see how many of you have seen this before, you know, if you just put a thumb up or a heart or whatever you want to use, it'll give me an idea. Yeah, a few of you. Okay, don't worry if you haven't. And just out of interest, if you maybe use your thumb up again, if you've actually used it as a structure to help you with your reflections. Few of you, okay. Great, okay. Right. So I'll just talk through it as well, just to clarify what we mean by these. So originally, so we've got this 4-dimensional approach, it's called. So we've got reflect before, reflect in, reflect on, and reflect beyond action. The reflect in and reflect on have been around for a long time. They were coined by someone called Sean, who's written a lot about reflective practice. But then in more recent years, if you like, so that was in the 80s, early 80s, reflect before and reflect beyond have been sort of added in there. Okay. And we'll explain how these work together. So reflect before then, yeah, they're all pretty self-explanatory of what they are, but what happens is quite, and the purpose of which is what's important really. So reflect before is about reflection, okay, it can be referred to. And it links very strongly with that noticing stage that Moon refers to that we looked at in the previous slide. So you understand that what the situation you're about to embark on is either familiar to you. So you think, well, yes, I've come across, I've done a training activity similar to this before. It's just in a different context. And I've done a lot of work using the curriculum lately to develop some of, long story short, but to develop some more targeted reflective resource for the future. But I've noticed how, because I'm not a scientist and I'm certainly not a scientist in 29 specialties, I've noticed, that there's similar activities, but in different contexts. So you might have to perform a particular test and interpret the result and then write a report. But that can happen multiple times, but for different conditions, let's say. So you might say, well, I've already done this process for X condition. Now this is asking me to do it for this one. What is going to be similar in this situation that I've already experienced, and what's going to be different about it? So you start to see that in that reflect before action. And basically, it's about thinking about what you're going to do before you do it. So, we would say that that's good practice, whether you're whatever stage in your career you are, it's important to think about what you're doing before you actually enter into it. Okay. And it involves you drawing upon previous experiences or transferable skills that you've already developed elsewhere. Then we've got the reflect in action. So that, as it suggests, occurs during the event. So it's quite a higher level skill in some situations. And this is where you're making sense of the situation as it unfolds. So it links in with that making sense stage of learning that Moon identifies. And it's the decisions you make whilst engaging with that activity or with that experience. So something might happen that was unexpected and you have to adjust your behaviours or adjust what you're doing to best handle the situation in front of you. So it's very dynamic in that way. So it's basically, in simple terms, being aware of what you're doing whilst you're doing it, or being aware of what's happening in that moment. So before action is being aware of the situation before you enter into it, and this is being aware of and reacting during the activity, so during the experience. Then we get to reflect on, and reflect on action is basically what we tend to associate with reflection. It's about taking a step back after the event and considering what happened and what you can learn from the experience and how it's going to influence your future practice. So it links very strongly with that making meaning and working with meaning that Moon mentions. Some people might use a model of reflection for this. So they might, as a tool, so Gibbs or Kolb or whichever ones that they, there's loads out there that suit their sort of reflective style. It can be used when things go wrong, so you might focus on when things go wrong, but it's also important when things go well to understand why they went well and how you can use that learning to actually inform your practice in the long term. But also it might just be for things that were surprising, so things that took you by surprise, but you reacted well to it. But that can be really insightful as well. So it's where you actually, as part of your reflect on action, you would actually refer back to how well you reflected before and how well you reflected in as well, what happened in those stages too. And then finally, we have reflect beyond, and this links really strongly with Moon's transformative learning because it's about sort of yeah, it's about you revisiting an event later, so not soon after, like with the reflect on, but sometime later. So it depends on the context, but it could be months later, it could be years later, and it's to help you reframe what happened and apply any learning that you've gained since, to actually see if you've sort of see those sort of experiences differently. And one part of that might be what's very common now in medical education and medical training is, and beyond that as well, so post qualifying as well, is using professional storytelling to enhance learning. So it's where professionals share their individual experience of practice with each other. And they, sort of so individual cases where they feel were a particular challenge and they bring it to a group and they discuss it together, ask questions to say, well, what made you approach it in that way? Have you thought about X, Y, and Z? So it's a very supportive process. It's not about sort of finger pointing and saying, oh, you did a really bad job there. It's about trying to unpick how best to address situations like that in the future. And also if someone feels, like having a difficult time processing a certain situation, then it can be a supportive environment for that too. But in the context for yourselves, what that could be used for is, if you're prepared, it's about revisiting your reflections from your training activities to help prepare you for your in-person assessments for that module. So if you've got a CBD coming up, you say, right, okay, I'll just revisit the relevant training activities for that and see, what my reflections were around that and the feedback that I got, and how is this going to prepare me for undertaking the CBD. So again, all four stages of this, or all four dimensions, of good practice. Yeah, they're good practice for anybody, whether they're in a training position like yourselves or post-training. Because to register with the HCPC, for example, to be a clinical scientist, you need to demonstrate these skills that you are engaging in lifelong learning. And this is what this encourages is, you're in a fast-moving environment. We know things change politically around the NHS and working in healthcare, but also things change all the time in science, don't they? So, and in your specialism, there's going to be changes all the time. So this enables you to be reactive as well as proactive about your own professional development. And, just to bear in mind, it's cyclical because one feeds into the other. So as we said, when you get to reflect on action, you're going to be drawing on how you prepared for it. In action, you're going to think about how you prepared for it as well. In your reflect, you're going to think about preparing and how you engaged in it. And post that, the reflect beyond action is going to draw on all this and multiple experiences of it potentially, and then feed into your practice next time and how you approach tasks in the future or experiences in the future. And this just is another way of illustrating that, basically, that you reflect before and reflect in are going to influence your reflect on and reflect beyond. Okay. So in terms of reflection and specialist training activities, you have the requirement is for your work, if you look at the work-based assessment standards, that for DTAs, you need to reflect at one or more points in time after the event. So obviously you're going to be reflecting on that at some point. You're going to reflect on that activity, so reflect after it. ETAs, you're going to reflect at multiple points in time, because you're going to have to repeatedly and consistently and effectively over time be able to do that activity in a range of different situations. So by that, there's going to be lots of reflection taking place. So one way to illustrate that is very basic way, that what you might find, you have lots of engagement with that cycle for entrustable training activities. For the developmental training activities, you might only have 1 or 2 incidences of you doing that. And you might be in your head saying, yeah, but you said, and the training the assessment standards say, I only have to really reflect once for the DTAs. So why bother engaging with the 4-dimensional approach to reflection? There's 2 ways of looking at this. There's the evidence for your portfolio as one, and the other side is developing the skill at reflection and being a lifelong learner. So you could engage with that cycle that we looked at, that 4-dimensional approach to reflection, but you don't need to evidence it all for the DTAs. You might just have one post, so one reflect on action, reflection on the activity, and that's enough to satisfy your portfolio of evidence. But I would say that it's to think about what you're doing before you enter into it, to think about what you're doing whilst you're doing it, are both good practice, aren't they? So you don't necessarily have to evidence it. So I'm not asking you, nobody's asking you to do more work than is required to satisfy the training activity. But really, in the roles that you're looking to enter into, it's more than just a series of training activities. Once you get that piece of paper in your hand to say that you're now a clinical scientist, your learning doesn't stop there. So it's about, the more you can practice that reflective thinking. And as I said, it's not just about what you do to satisfy a training activity, it's about developing that cognitive skill of reflective thinking. It's more, you can start to see that it's merely that process, that 4-dimensional approach is just merely articulating what we would expect to be good practice as a reflective clinical scientist. Now, I have got guidance for that, which I'm hoping you've seen, because it's got some, sort of prompts for that. So like I said, you don't have to evidence every aspect of it. So for the reflect before, it asks you some questions about what do you already know about this, and it could be just some mental notes that you make to help prepare you for the activity that you're about to embark on, or it could be that you write some physical notes, but it doesn't have to be some perfect piece. It is literally just to get you thinking beforehand before you enter into it, and it can really help focus you when it comes to doing an activity or an experience that might not be a training activity. And then we've got the same for the ETAs as well, and it's written slightly differently to reflect the fact that it's for something that you have to be able to be entrusted to do independently. Now, when reflecting on action, so after an event, I've mentioned before many a time, and in the resources that I've developed in the Learning Hub, that there are lots of different models for reflection. And some people really engage with one or more of those and find them really useful. Other people find them as a real barrier to actually reflecting, because they get so bogged down by the actual framework of it that they're not actually reflecting, because they're just worried about not satisfying each stage of the model. And they should be a tool to help, not a tool to hinder. So the guidance I've produced that I just showed you a screenshot of before provides you with a framework for it, for the dimensions actually, which I'll show you if we get a chance. Or you can just follow this as a framework for reflect on. So you've got describe what happened, review, and then impact and action. And the learning actually comes through more from the review part and the impact and action than the description. Now, the description's important just to set the scene, but it really is not where the learning occurs. It just sets the foundation for it. Okay, so it's the shortest part of the reflection, sets the scene, just provides a summary of those key points of that experience. It'll be selective, so you won't necessarily reflect or describe everything that happened, because that would be not appropriate to do so. So if you attended if you were undertaking a clinic, rather, you wouldn't necessarily reflect on every patient. You might just select certain aspects of your practice related to each of those ones. So it might just be your communication skills that you're focusing on, or it might be just one particular patient that really piqued your interest in what you wanted to reflect on. So, you know, that it's about being selective there. It's not a blow-by-blow account. It's not a police witness statement, so it doesn't, have to have absolutely everything in there. And it's certainly not an essay. It's not about quantity, it's about quality when it comes to your reflections. You've got the review part, and that part is where you're assessing it, basically. What was good or bad about the experience? What surprises were there? How did it link to any prior knowledge and experience that you had? Did it conflict with what you were expecting? So you're bringing in then sort of you reflect before and reflect in. Was there any significant moments that stuck out to you, and why is that? It's basically about you gaining insight into your own practice. So this is where the deeper learning is starting to occur, and you're unpicking the experience. You're taking a step back and seeing, what you're learning from it. And then the impact and action is very much about how that experience will influence your own behaviour and attitudes, and what you need to do to assimilate that new learning into practice. So what are your next steps? What would I do differently in this situation next time? And how is it going to support you in preparing for your observed assessment? And basically it's about that reinforcement of learning and making it meaningful there. And that's where you might produce an action plan for definite, what steps you're going to take to improve or take that learning into your practice going forward. When it comes to your reflections being assessed, these are the important parts of that, is your review of it and what impact and actions you're going to take. Okay, the description is just that. It's just those that what happened, and those can be just bullet points. It can be just whatever, if you're writing it, it can be just nice and short and just set the context. Assessing reflections, and I shared this with the training officers yesterday who attended. It should be, so when they're assessing your reflections, and when you self-assess your reflections as well, it should focus on the learning that you've gleaned from it. So it's about that how well you've demonstrated that growth mindset in terms of your own practice. Sorry, clear my chest. There should be evidence of you undertaking the activity, and actually, depending on the activity itself, the reflection might be enough to evidence that you actually undertook that activity, but it depends what it is. Okay. But you can tell if someone's, I strongly believe that you can tell if somebody's making up a reflection. And I think you can tell if someone's tried to use AI to create a reflection, because it lacks that contextualized evidence, really, that they were there. It's hard to provide concrete examples of something that you haven't engaged in directly. So, a lot of the time the reflection might be, and you've got to discuss this with your training officer, also enough to show that you've undertaken that activity. It's about, them evaluating how self-aware you are and you self-evaluating as well that. So when you reflect on your practice, have you considered your own feelings and tried to understand the perspectives of others? And that's not just merely stating, oh, I felt really nervous about it. It's about, well, how's your feelings changed now you've engaged and looking back at that activity? Do you feel more confident about doing something similar in the future? What will you do to enhance your ability to undertake that activity or enhance your confidence with that, etc.? What skills are you developing that's going to help you in the future with that activity? And I've added self-assessment into this one because previously when I did this similar thing to the OTAs, I didn't have self-assessment in there because rotations and the OTAs, they're very much about you observing other people. So it's harder to self-assess if you've never really done it. But you could still assess your own confidence in relation to certain activities that you've observed. But I think it's even more pertinent with your specialist ones. So how confident do you now feel with the knowledge, the practice, your own ability? Is there skills gaps there that you still want to fulfill, basically? So that insight is what they should be, looking for and what you should be delivering, really. And it's about depth of reflection. So now when we talk about depth, we're not talking about quantity. We're talking about, somebody could write equivalent to 2-page reflection, but actually not reflect at all. They're just describing events. Whereas you could have someone that's just done, a quarter of a page and actually have shown great depth because they're actually focused on what they've actually got out of that and what they're going to do with that information, that learning to move forward. So please remember that it's not an academic piece of writing. It is very much linked to your work-based practice, and it's about really looking at what am I going to do in order to progress. I've had some feedback on how I did X. What am I going to do with this feedback and what is it telling me in order to progress forward? So it's about that developing deeper learning and greater insight, and that's developing those critical thinking skills as well. So it's about your training officer, assessors, peers can support you with that as well too. And then finally we've got actions. So whatever you've learned, whatever you've identified in your reflections should be developed into some kind of actions. And that again shows that greater depth because it shows that you're converting that learning into concrete ways of actually progressing. So what are you going to do with this new knowledge or new understanding about your own practice and the behaviours of others? We know an action plan is a requirement of the DTA, so you have to have an action plan in place. But you will probably find you have a series of mini action plans for the ETAs because it's a continuous cycle that each time you engage with an activity, you're reflecting on it, and part of those reflections will create some kind of actions for you to then for next time you engage with that activity again, and it's that continuous cycle. And I've got a way of illustrating that shortly. I'm apologising for this in advance. It's something I produced on the very quickly, but just as an illustration. And if you think it would be useful to you, you can use it, but it's not mandatory at all. And you might want to change the wording of it. But this was just, referring back to when I mentioned self-assessment on this one here, about assessing your own confidence and how you feel about a particular training activity or a particular skill that's required within a particular training activity. particularly for the ETAs, because you've got to be entrusted to be able to undertake those activities independently, or know when not to, then sort of having this, sometimes it can be quite powerful for you to actually think, well, how actually on a scale of 1 to 5, how confident do I really feel about undertaking this? And why is that? So it might be that you put in a couple of reflections there. And again, depth of reflection doesn't mean that you have, insight can be gained in a few words, or demonstrated in a few words rather. It doesn't have to be something that's, this huge document. Okay, so it might be an ongoing thing that you do after engaging with similar activities, that you make comment, let's say you're patient facing, that you make comment on your patient communication, especially if your confidence level isn't quite where you want it to be. You might reflect on what you need to do and why you feel that way, and put a little action for yourself on how you might improve that. So, this is very rudimentary, but if you wanted to design your own, you could. I did mention this to the assessors and training officers yesterday, but it can form a basis of discussion between you and your training officer as well, because it can inform sort of their planning to support you in your own planning, and also support you with actions that you might need to take, and identifying gaps in practice, all sorts of things. And it can open up a conversation, because you might not feel confident with it, but actually your ability is very good at doing it. But, we can, I'm talking from experience here, sometimes we can't see where our skills are, and that's really important to be able to see those skills. And sometimes that can open up that conversation between you and your assessor as well. Sorry, I just got distracted by my very needy greyhound, and I was wondering what he was up to. He's now shutting himself in the bedroom. Oh no, he's all right. Sorry about that. Anyway, so referring back to the action planning, as we know, an action plan is mentioned clearly in the work-based assessment standards as being part of the evidence. But what I would say is this is, I was having a play, as you can see. For ETAs, you might have, as I mentioned before, these very sort of mini action plans after each reflection that you do. So action planning for ETAs will be in the short or medium term. So what you need to do rather, to move to entrusted status in that activity. So they'll happen as part of the reflective practice cycle. So they won't be in addition to that. It's part of that cycle anyway, isn't it? To reflect, then, so you reflect, try and make sense of it, analyze it, and then identify what you're going to do in order to improve or develop for next time. And that's specifically in relation to that reflect on action and reflect beyond. Action planning for the DTAs is more in the medium long term. So you're identifying areas for future development, and that action plan for the DTA won't necessarily be satisfied within the STP even, because you might not come across the situation again. So it's for the medium to long term more. So hopefully that makes sense, what I'm trying to illustrate there. So wider evidence for specialist modules then. And again, this is something that I go through anyway when I'm talking about developing evidence, whether it's for OTAs, ETAs, DTAs, DTAs for the core modules, whatever evidence you produce, it has to be authentic. So it has to be yours. So your assessor has to be confident that the evidence you're presenting to them is genuinely your work. Okay. Of course, we've got some plagiarism detection software in one file, which kind of safeguards against that to a certain extent. But I think the unique nature of work-based assessment and the evidence that your work-based learning rather than work-based training, the evidence that you produce tends to be hard to fake it. It has, it will be obvious, it should be obvious to the people that you're working alongside if you haven't performed a particular task yourself, and they should be able to pick that up. It needs to be valid. So validity relates to that it's got to be relevant to the training activity. So it gives an accurate picture of your performance within that particular area. And then we've got reliability. And this, we've talked a little bit about this already in terms of the reflections, but it needs to be sufficient in quantity, quality, and relevant. And it's not academic study, so there is no word count. It wouldn't be appropriate to do that because not all evidence is going to be written. I'll come to that, or has to be written even, and we'll come to that shortly. In terms of reliability, it can take many sort of forms. Insufficient evidence isn't necessarily that there isn't enough of evidence. There could be loads of evidence in there, but it just might mean that it's not sufficient evidence that's relevant. And there's a difference, isn't there? So as we said before, you could have 2-page reflection, but it doesn't actually reflect. It just describes what happened. So that is insufficient because it's not actually doing what it's supposed to do, compared to someone who might just have a half-page reflection and it is actually demonstrating their learning and progress. So it is sufficient. So that's why we don't have word counts, because it's going to be very different for different people as well. So someone doing an ETA is an example where you've got to have you'll have multiple reflections. Someone might have 2 or 3 and they've achieved that training activity and their assessor is confident that they are able to be entrusted with that activity, whereas another person might have 10, and that's okay because it's taken that, in order for them to get the experience and to be confident and to be entrusted with that activity. So that's why we don't have word counts, because it's just pointless and it doesn't work in the context of this. It's not academic study, it's work-based training and learning. And the final one is currency. So what the evidence that you provide has to be up to date, and it has to have been developed whilst on the programme, even if you've experienced or completed the same activity prior to joining the programme. And this is to make sure that it is valid, authentic and reliable in terms of the evidence as well. It doesn't mean you can't draw on previous experiences in relation to current experiences, but you can't rely on those previous experiences on their own because it has to be part of this, part of on programme. So basically, all evidence, any evidence that you develop needs to be authentically yours, needs to be valid, so relevant to the training activity, needs to be sufficient, and it needs to be up to date. And this is not an exhaustive list at all, here's a range of types of evidence that you might include depending on the training activities. We've got action plans, witness testimonies, observations of your practice, different types of reports, responses to any questions you've been asked, responses to case studies, etc. Just to reiterate here, some of you, might have to use simulations in your practice, because of the nature of some activities can't be planned for, so you use simulations instead. The simulation itself, you engaging in that simulation on its own is not evidence. The evidence will be these things. So someone might write a witness testimony to say, yeah, you engaged with the simulation, you demonstrated X, Y, and Z. Your reflection on that simulation will also be evidence. It might be any feedback you received on how well you did that simulation. That will also form part of the evidence. So you can see how, you know, that the experience itself is not the evidence. It's these things that you can see that actually show that you did it and the learning from it. Because someone could attend a simulation or do a simulation and not actually engage with it, you know. So there's other ways of looking at it. Anyway, format of evidence, I've already mentioned that. So you might, you know, the common one, like if we think of reflections, you might write it, but you don't have to. So speak to your training officer about whether, you know, explain, you know, if you're struggling with written reflections, then why have it as a barrier to reflection if you can record yourself verbally, you know, do it like almost like a you know, like a vlog type thing, or you know, whatever. If it means what's important is you reflecting, not necessarily how it's presented. So speak to your training officer if you're struggling to write your reflections. You can do it verbally with them. So, you know, as far as we're concerned, that's perfectly acceptable that you have a one-to-one with your training officer or assessor. You they ask you probing questions to elicit more reflective thinking. And then you just write in the free text box in one file to say that you undertook a reflection verbally with your training officer or assessor. And then the training officer writes in their feedback to affirm that it took place, and they might comment on the discussion. You might have some Q&A in there with the assessor that you put in, and have a professional discussion with your assessor. Yeah, and that might be part of it as well. So there's different ways of doing things. We've got graphic organisers in there. It's a nice visual way to record information, and that could be reflections. It could be mind maps could be used as a tool, you know, for doing your action plans, all sorts of different ways that you can do that. And if you've got any ideas that you've used that have really worked for you, then let me know, and you're happy to share them. We can put that in the Learning Hub or on the website. And that brings me to the triangulation of evidence. And I have talked about this before when I do the OTA talk. I'll just have a sip. My lukewarm coffee. So you need to provide evidence to show that you're able to undertake a training activity and that you've engaged in it. And one way to do that is through this triangulation of evidence. And this can improve reliability and validity of that evidence, because you're not asking one piece of evidence to do all the heavy lifting. And the different sources that that evidence can come from is illustrated there. So 3 different sources, so conversation type, work products, and observation. It doesn't mean that you'll just have 3 pieces of evidence, but rather you're generating evidence from at least 3 different sources. So you might have multiple pieces of evidence for a training activity. And again, the important thing to remember is that they need to be naturally occurring, really, as part of your training. So you shouldn't be expected to write an essay on something. It wouldn't necessarily be, well, it wouldn't be appropriate. Okay. Most of how the activities are written, it's about, you know, developing evidence that would be relevant to the job in hand. So we're going to have are we going to have a look at them, or am I just going to mention some? I'm just going to mention some for the purpose of this, actually. So the conversations type, it might be questioning, professional discussions that you have, feedback from different sources. So you might get feedback from patients, you might get feedback from colleagues or peers. But conversations can also be your reflections, because they're like a conversation with yourself. But also you might engage in group reflection of some kind. So that professional storytelling, discussing cases with peers or near peers, etc. The observations, pretty self-explanatory. So there might be assessor observations of you performing tasks, might be you observing other people, it might be peers observing you and giving you some feedback, and you are reflecting on that. Witness testimonies by expert witnesses as well were classed as observations. And then we've got products, so the work products. So it might be any clinical reports you've produced, or business or service reports. It could be the action plans that you've developed, any certificates that you've achieved or received from some training activity, from attending some training rather, or something that you've produced or adapted in the course of your work. So that could be a SOP that you've developed or updated. It could be a risk assessment that you've written or updated. It might be minutes of meetings showing showing that you contributed to that meeting. It could be absolutely anything. So you could see for one training activity, you'd have multiple pieces of evidence. And it wouldn't necessarily require any more work for you. It's just supportive evidence to support some of your reflections, might be to support observations that were undertaken of your practice, etc. Okay. So again, come back to my very sophisticated, not so much, slide that I used before. But in terms of evidence, you might find that for developmental training activities, there might be just one or two pieces of evidence. Whereas with the ETAs, you might have multiple incidences because you're doing it multiple times. Yeah. You're having to show that you've undertaken it multiple times in order to hone those skills in different contexts. So as a collective, then you can see that for a DTA, you might have some supportive evidence, your reflection, and an action plan. But for your ETAs, you might have multiple incidences of that collective. So of evidence, reflective practice. So evidence that you undertook the activity, your reflection, and an action plan.